full day today,
She's
so
the
we're
one
going and
faculty
everybody
right
else is
there.
just going to catch up.
Oh,
Okay.
That's a lot of pressure.
You just can't fall asleep. That's the only thing. Okay, so the first half of what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about manuals of procedure. Hey there. Just getting going, so come on in. Hey, no worries. I was just saying we're going to have kind of a full day, so I'm going to try to get us cranking through our stuff.
Great.
So the first half of the day, we're going to talk about manual procedures. So people sometimes call them manual of operations. They're sort of like standard operating procedures, but as opposed to standard operating procedures, they don't really stand alone as much. It's a whole document together that talks about how the study works. Because I know you guys, with clinical stuff, they're standard operating procedures all the time. So we'll talk about it a little bit further. So the biggest question people always ask me is why bother with a mop? And I often have the same question myself because it takes a lot of work. But one thing that it helps you do is it helps you maintain the consistency in your data collection. So over time, across people, across sites, it's making sure that everybody is thinking about things appropriately. And so it serves as a common reference for staff. So it could be that if people are saying, well, that's not how I do that, or what do you do in this case? It's something that the staff can reference together. They all have the same document. They can look at it. And for staff that are in different spots, too, they can look at it and think about, compare across different settings for how the data collection is being put together.
Sorry, can you go back? You made one comment about standalone versus not standalone. Can you just repeat that comment?
Yeah, that was just about standard operating procedures. Lots of times SOPs, sometimes they're standalone where, it's an SOP for this one situation.
I see.
And a manual procedure is a little bit more integrating across things. And so I'll go into that in a lot more detail in just a bit. Yeah, so thank you for checking. Similar idea, but it provides the basis for how you're going to train your staff. So it helps you ensure that you've got standardized training for people. And it also allows you to cross-train people on different procedures. Lots of times there will be folks that specialize in one or two of your standard data collection procedures, and somebody else is doing another 3 or 4, but you got to count for vacations and all that kind of stuff. So you want to make sure that people can be cross-trained. Then finally, and this is the part that often becomes the most important, it provides a historical record for you. So if you're going back 5 years from now, you'll remember how did you do that particular data collection piece. You're writing things up. You want to include them. You want to include that procedure or that data collection activity again. You have something written up about it. And then finally, it's a communication tool. So for those multi-site studies where you can't all be in the same room, teleconferencing obviously has changed a lot of that, but still it makes sure that there's communication across all the sites. So that's why we bother. What do we include? So the first piece clearly is the specific steps that you go through to do data collection. But that includes how are you going to code the data and any kind of post-collection procedures. So anything that you're doing for shipping or storing, it takes you all the way through from beginning to end on a particular kind of procedure. It also gives you the logistics for how you're integrating different components. So one of the classics that I always think about is with these big epi studies, lots of times blood pressure is measured, lots of times people get blood drawn. You don't want to measure blood pressure after somebody's had their blood drawn because enough people are anxious about the procedure, about phlebotomy, that you want to go ahead and get their blood pressure when they're calm. So this is the kind of thing that you can lay out in your MOP, and that's where we're talking about the integrating across. So you would have something that would say, these are the steps for collecting blood pressure, these are the steps for drawing blood, but you'd have another piece that says this is how we're going to weave these things together. And then you also want to make sure that you include any of your quality control procedures. You want to include anything about your data forms, and it may be that if you have electronic forms that you decide that someplace you have posted a PDF of what those forms look like. There's a variety of ways in which you can include your forms. And then finally, equipment and supplies. So you want to do this for two reasons. For being able to ensure any of your unique equipment is people are all ordering the same model number. But also, it makes sure that people are clear what they're going to need to have handy as they get started on a study. Particularly when you're looking at clinical trials that may be running on over multiple years. You may have staff that are working on maybe 4 or 5 different trials. And so they need a reminder, what do we need to have tomorrow or this next week? What do we need to have for this particular study? So having all of that in the MOP, someplace written down, is helpful. So this is the typical kind of table of contents. Pay attention to this because this is part of the assignment coming up. You want to have an overview of the study. This is useful because it allows you to, as your study progresses, new team members may come on, either investigators or staff, and it gives you the opportunity to have usually it's going to be a 2 to 3 page overview max. It may even be 2 paragraphs, depending on how complicated your study is. But it gives an overview. So what are you hoping to accomplish with this? What kind of data are you collecting? Who are you collecting it with? Etc. Your recruitment procedures, you for sure want to be able to document how are you bringing people into your study. Then a detailed description of each component. We'll get into that in more detail here. And then guidelines for organizing the visit. So just as I was talking about before, this idea of logistics. And sometimes that means things that you want to make sure that have been done pre-visit. But also it gives staff the opportunity to know how to handle it if something goes, if there's something where you can't do a particular measurement or something. It gives them some guidelines for that. QC procedures and schedules. The schedules in particular are important. You can have your procedures down there all you want, but if people aren't doing the QC on a regular schedule, then it's not accomplishing what it needs to.
QC.
Quality control. Yeah. And then post-visit tasks, like we talked about before. So coding, one of the classics there is lots of times there'll be an interview that asks people about their employment status. And so there may be a whole coding system that you go through to be able to classify people. The census has a big coding system. So it may be that you're using that. You may have a set of coding instructions that you want to provide to interviewers about their success at recruiting somebody. So some of that will be outlined there. And that might be after the person has been there. And then also, how are you shipping different things? It might be specimens, it might be images, so etc. And then, as I mentioned before, data collection form screenshots. And then data management activities. So we'll talk a little bit if there's somebody who's manually entering information from a paper form, you want to have some talk about that. You want to talk about how, different ways in which you may be looking at data across different pieces. So some of that goes into QC, but we'll talk about that. So this is the kind of thing that you want to have in your table of contents for your MOP. We're going to go through some of this, and then I'm going to show you guys some specific examples. You'll see that there's URLs later in the slides to go out to some of these big studies to look at it. Okay, so let's break down some of these to think a little bit more clearly about what goes into the sections around these topics. So in the study overview, you want everybody to know why are you doing the study. So the goal, what are you trying to accomplish? Then you do still want to give some background. So it's, your whole background and significance section that you would have either in a paper or in a grant. You're giving the historical reason for why you're doing this study. Oftentimes it's helpful to have the organizational structure of the study, so the study team. If you are working with folks at other locations, either because they're another data collection site or because it's a lab or reading center or something like that, it's helpful to understand those relationships and who's talking to who. And then the other thing that's interesting to have in the overview is how decisions get made. So, if it's you and 2 RAs and, maybe a colleague that's serving as investigator, then maybe it's pretty clear how the decisions get made. But with these bigger studies, you want to talk about which group has the right to make decisions about which sorts of things. Interestingly, one of the big projects we're working on right now, we've been around for 5 years, and one of the key problems is that this decision-making structure relies on a committee, and that committee is weak. And so we're having lots of problems because this committee has not sort of stepped up and taken its responsibility. So anyway, so that's the kind of thing that you can have in an overview. So a little bit about the science, but then a little bit about the organization as well. For recruitment, and we're going to talk later in the quarter, we'll have a class where we're going to talk more specifically about recruitment procedures and the kinds of things that you can do and the sorts of things that make people want to participate in studies. But for the manual procedures, these are the kinds of things you want to think about. So what's the selection criteria? And you want it to be clear. You don't want there to be this fuzziness. You want to have some very clear ways in which you're describing what your selection criteria are. And then how are you going to be determining this eligibility for people? So what are the screening procedures? Are you doing something over the phone? Do you actually see them in person? Is it a chain where you first talk to them on the phone, and if they go through that level of eligibility, do you then see them again? Do you see them to run more of a test to see whether they meet your criteria? How do you code your outcomes? This is really helpful for you to understand if there's a way you need to change your recruitment procedures. There are multiple examples of studies that have lessened their criteria because they found that when they went with their first round, they weren't getting anybody in, but they had enough detail information to know, for instance, someone was screening out because of their blood pressure value, perhaps, rather than just screened out as ineligible. So being able to know what those reasons are, it's also very helpful to be able to code the reasons or people are telling you that they don't want to participate. So is it that it's not worth their time? Does that mean that you need to offer a little bit more of an incentive? Is it a transportation issue? If you find out that there's enough transportation reasons, does that then mean that you need to think about how you could be setting up that transportation? So there's lots of different reasons. It's good to be fairly detailed in how you code your outcomes, just so that you can understand what's happening. Then super helpful for everyone can be a flow chart for making the decisions about when you're enrolling them and when randomization decisions get made. So many times people are not randomized until they've completed their baseline visit. Why do you think that's the case?
You want to make sure that they're eligible for inclusion in the study.
That's right. That's one thing. You want to make sure they're eligible. What would be another reason why?
Want to make sure they actually are going to show up.
Yep, that's another good one. That's
Not
good.
What you're getting at, though.
But you're getting it. So one of the main issues that you have to pay attention to, this is the whole idea about whether somebody can criticize your study or not. You want to make sure that your baseline measures, nobody knows what group they're going to be in because you don't want there to be differential measurement. So you don't want your study staff to be like, oh, we really need some more people in our control group, so we're going to, really be extra nice to them, or, but people, we all tend to do that. We want to work towards our goal. And so it's very often that someone will get randomized after you've completed your baseline visit. But the issues that you raise are also important ones. Then in the recruitment procedures, you want to talk about how are you going to document that randomization. We're going to go into some of the specifics about different things that people use. There's very low-tech ways and there's very high-tech ways to randomize, depending. But you want to make sure in your MOP you describe how is randomization documented. Because, again, that's something that an auditor may come to look at. They want to make sure that you're truly randomizing people and not pseudo-randomizing them. Finally, one of the things that can be very useful here, particularly for staff who are smart but maybe not have the scientific depth of understanding of why you're doing the study, is have some ways to answer the frequently answered questions of people. So, why are you measuring C-reactive protein? That's not really, it's becoming more common for people to talk about it, but a lot of people are still like, what does that do for me? Why do you care about that? And so you want to have some explanation for your staff to be able to talk about. Why can't I know what kind of medication I'm getting? Why might I be getting fake medication? Okay, you want to be able to have some explanation about that. So all of these things fit into the recruitment procedure because this is the part where you're describing how you're getting someone into your study. Okay. Questions?
Just actually about the homework, and maybe it will be more clear by the end of this lecture, but what kind of level of detail are we supposed to be going into for our table of contents?
It's a great question. Hold it and see if I answer it, and then if I don't, get back to me. Not this level of detail.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
That's kind of like,
okay. Okay. So then the next thing that you want to have is you're going to have chapters that are about your individual components. So again, I'm going to refer back to these cardiovascular epi studies. Sharon and I both have worked on those enough. You're going to get enough of those examples over the quarter, but they're useful. So common measures are blood pressure, anthropometrics. Okay, school public health. Okay. You've got blood pressure, anthropometrics, probably a medical history interview. In older adults, we often do gait measures. So each of those would be their own chapter because you want to be able to delve into the detail about how you're collecting the data for that. So you want to have step-by-step instructions that says, number 1, have the person take their shoes off. Number 2, have them go stand with their back to the wall against the ruler. This is how you're measuring height. Okay, so you've got like 8 steps for measuring height, but that's because you're being clear about how you want it to be done, and somebody can read it. Now, compared to many years ago, it's a lot easier to make a video for these things. So it's not necessarily a problem to use a video, but by forcing yourself to write it down, then you can be clear about some of the things that maybe aren't obvious in a video. So, but it may be that you could trim some of what you're saying because you can include something like that for someone. So consider that. Illustrations, super, super useful. So we had a study where we were measuring vision, and you were supposed to hold a card a certain distance from your nose, and some people were holding it up here and some people were holding it down here. And why would that matter?
It's a different distance, actually.
A little bit of a different distance, that's right. Also, if you're like me, you have bifocals. And so if you're reading it up here versus reading it down here, you're going to get a different answer. And so This is one situation where it was very helpful to have that picture, because then we referred back to it and we're like, oh, okay, I see what we're supposed to be doing. Great. You want to have a full list of the equipment that you need, and down to the alcohol wipes. That means if you are using a particular, like you're using a probe to do ankle brachial index, for instance, you want to have the wipes that you use to clean off the probe so that when you use it on the next person, it's clean. So have the full list of equipment and supplies that are needed to be able to accomplish this task. You don't want anybody making it up because they think that something needs to be there. Then lots of times it's helpful to have a summary or a chart for quick reference. And I'm sure all of you have encountered this in some of your other work. And this is also, right, we see it in everyday life too. You've been trained on how to do something, but you just need a reminder. Remember to do this, then this, then this, then this. And so if you put those into this, into the mop, then everybody's using the same one. And then here you want to refer to any of the specific quality control procedures that you're using. So for blood pressure, back when you know, it used to be manual, where you were listening with a stethoscope, we would actually have people get their blood pressure measured twice. But you can't do that on everybody because that's very resource intensive. So we had an explanation about how you would select the person that would be randomly selected to have their blood pressure measured twice, but they also would describe what you wanted to do to allow that person to sort of be back at a resting state in order to best measure that blood pressure. Okay, so we'll look at some more examples of this, but this is the kind of thing you're like, oh, okay, yeah, no, I get that. This is how the individual pieces are happening. Now, how do they fit together? So having a chapter that describes the flow of the visit can be very, very helpful. You want to describe anything that the staff should have done or that the participants should have done before they get there. So are there reminder calls that need to be done? Are there tubes that need, do you need to make a tube kit in order to take it down to the lab? Do you have something that you want the participant to have done to bring back to you? So perhaps there's like a food diary that you've asked them to keep. So you might make a reminder call. Don't forget to bring your food diary. Don't forget to bring all your meds, blah, blah, blah. Then you want to describe the consenting process. And later in the class today, we're going to talk in more detail about the consenting process, but there are some places where you need to describe this because people need to understand what they are consenting for. And I'll give you some of those examples. In the visit flow, it's where you can describe how you're assigning the ID and what the ID means. We talked a little bit about that last time, that sometimes parts of your ID can indicate either how they're matched with another person or the site that they're from, that kind of thing. Then critically important, so that your staff are not slowed down when you are in the middle of clinic and they can't page you for a question. Is there flexible timing for components, or is there some rigidity to it? So like what I just mentioned, blood pressure and phlebotomy, that's rigid. You always want blood pressure to come before phlebotomy. But could you do blood pressure and then gait and then medical history, then phlebotomy? Sure. Could you change the order of those 2, 3, and 4? Probably. There's probably not a big deal having to. So what kind of flexibility do people have, and what kind of things must follow in a particular order? Then associated with that, what would be abbreviated visits? This happens all the time. Somebody walks in, you've got them scheduled for 3 hours, and they're like, I can be here for an hour. And you're like, okay, well, you're here. We don't want to miss the opportunity that you're sitting in front of me. So what are our highest priority items? What do we have to get through versus what could be either deferred, maybe done over the phone, whatever. You also want to talk about partial eligibility. So when we look at things like functional assessments, you will often have people who can't complete all the functional assessments. I shouldn't say often, you will sometimes have people. It could be that someone can do a lot of the things that you need done, but that they can't, for instance, if they use a walker, that they either can't do the gait measurement that you want, or that you'd have to adjust something. So does that completely knock them out of the study? Maybe, if that's one of your primary outcomes, but maybe not if you're just trying to get some measure of overall functional status. Then the last thing is sub-study enrollment. So have any of you ever been involved with one of these studies that will have sort of a sub-component attached to it? So give me an example of one of those.
Or we have like bronchoscopy sub-study in spirometers, for example.
Okay, yeah, perfect. And the reason that we've got sub-studies, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a while, often it's because it's resource intensive, or either in terms of the amount of time for the person, in terms of the amount of cost it is to the study, and it may even be something that only certain people qualify for. So it may be not important to do it on the large majority of folks, but those that perhaps, I don't know, I'm going to make it up, have a history of asthma or something, that you want to make sure that you do that study for them. So in this visit flow, you want to talk about that sub-study enrollment, because it may affect how you're doing the other things in your study, how you're doing your other measures, and it affects perhaps how long someone is going to be involved on that day for a visit. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of examples here. We're going to look at the MESA study. And so just a reminder that the MESA study, MESA stands for Multi-Ethnic Study of Atherosclerosis. This is their exam 1, so this is their baseline study. And you can see that they have the whole manual here. I should have downloaded it already. Let's see if it'll open. Oh yeah, it's going to open, okay. They have the entire thing. So here is a table of contents. So when you're asking about what we're looking for in the table of contents, this is the kind of thing I'm looking for, okay? So what different chapters are in here? So the clinic exam, I'm not looking for all, and I'll just let you know, I'm not looking for all these different sub-bullets, like 3.4.1. I'm really just looking for these main chapter sections. So what are the different pieces that you want to have included? So this is the clinic examination, is their guidelines and flow. This is how you pull the different pieces together. So they're talking about things you need to do prior to the exam, what's the form. Then they're listing all the different interviews that need to be done. And then they're listing the different procedures, the stuff for the lab, the different ultrasound studies. All of these are included in their clinic exams. This is one way to structure a MOP, where you throw everything into the clinic exam. Let me show you let's see. I'm trying to remember what I wanted to do as the example here, sorry.
Sorry, where did you find the table of contents on that website?
Oh, I just downloaded the complete manual up at the top. Yeah. Sorry about that.
Thank
you. So let's look at their exam guidelines section. And so you can see this is where they're talking all about how the visit's going to be scheduled. Here's an important piece, that these measures all need to be done while someone is fasting. So you don't want to put those at the end of the 4-hour visit. You want to let somebody be able to have a snack. Mm-hmm. And then they also have certain things that need to be done before the CT and the MRI. Why is that? Because then you're excluding people who aren't eligible. And so that's an important consideration. So you can see, you can scroll down, and they're saying some things are up to the discretion of the site, whereas other things should be done in a particular order. Okay? Let's go back and look at their specimen list. What are all the different blood samples that they're going to collect? So here they're talking about what you're collecting and why. These folks were getting 65 mil collected from them. And you look at all the different supplies that they're talking about. So they're saying have a phlebotomy chair, have blood tube racks, have an ice bucket. I mean, that's how detailed they got into being sure that you have what it is you need to have to collect the blood. And then they specified here not just what kind of tubes to have, but the actual catalog number from the BD catalog so that you could be sure that everybody could be sure that they were collecting the same thing from the 6 sites where they were collecting across the country, because heaven forbid one site's using a slightly different version and maybe it was a different formulation for the preservative, and then you have unintentional variation. Okay, does that make sense? Then one more thing I wanted to look at was the ultrasound. So you can see here, the ultrasound, here's where they're specifying the actual model and equipment that you need to be using. Then they're talking about how the data are going to be transmitted to the reading center. So, this was several years ago, but nonetheless, by having one reading center, so all scans are being read by, all images are being read by the same group of people, then you're not getting variation across site. So this is describing how the different recordings should be made and how are you going to send it. Okay. So any questions about these kind of visit guidelines, flow sorts of things? Okay. Let's go back into here. Let's see. Sorry. Clicked the wrong thing. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about what we want to include in quality control. So I referred already to the fact that you want to talk about how are you going to select your QC participants. You're going to get the best indication of the quality of the data that you're collecting if you can be as random as you hope to collect from QC folks. However, operationally, that can be very difficult because it's hard to have back-to-back-to-back QC folks on a clinic day, perhaps. So another option is to just pick like the every 5th person. So at least you're getting, hopefully, a variation over days in the week, different staff members, etc. So whatever procedure you're using, specify it though so that folks are using it and not just happening to pick the people that are easiest to work with. That's not going to give you a good idea of how well everybody's doing their data collection. Then in the chapter, you can either refer to other chapters to talk about the specific QC procedures needed, or you could include it here. Different studies have done it different ways. It kind of depends on how elaborate it is to talk about the QC procedure. So there's no right or wrong about that, but you want to make sure that somewhere it's described how would you collect the QC data for this particular thing. And then the schedule, as I talked about before, you want to be sure that you are doing your QC over the period of your study. So sometimes it means that you are on a monthly schedule. And so you pick a day in the month when you're going to do QC. Sometimes studies will front load their QC. So it may be that you are conducting QC studies on 1 out of 4 for the first month to see how everything's going and just be sure. And then you can maybe scale back to 1 out of 8, 1 out of 10. So take a look at what your certification is. Your schedule is. Then you want to have some discussion in here about how you are training your staff and how are you certifying that they are ready for collection. We're going to spend a whole bunch of time on that later, but this is where you would describe that. Sometimes certification can simply be they attended the training. That's fine. That may be enough. But there are other things, for instance, waist and hip circumferences are notoriously difficult to get consistently. And so often what we will insist on with those is that not only do folks need to go through the training, do all this practice, but then they have to measure probably 3 to 5 people against a gold standard interviewer and be within a particular tolerance range for their measurements. And that's just because it's hard. It's hard to get it right. So your certification will depend a little bit on how important it is and how hard it is to do it right. Then it doesn't help to have QC if you don't have some plan for how you're going to look at it and what you're going to do if you find something wrong. So in here, think about what it is you're going to do. So for instance, let's say you've got someone who is consistently getting blood pressure measures that are, at least 5 points different from everybody else. So what are you going to do? Well, what you might do is you might have that person sort of do a refresher training. You might do some observation of them. You might have them not collect your study data for a while they practice until they can come back up to criterion. But you want to outline what those different procedures are here. And you'll see the links that I have, many of the MOPs that I'm looking at, that I've referenced before, you have these in there. Okay, so data forms and screenshots. The reason that you want to put that in there is because you may be referring to something in your chapter. Yes, ma'am.
Can I have a short
Of course.
Yeah. So how often should we do the quality control? How do you schedule that? Monthly or?
So it really kind of depends on how many people you're seeing, how quickly are you seeing people, and how much you think something could go out of tolerance. I think when you're regularly doing data collection, monthly is usually frequent enough, because it's like you're just spot checking. And I think even if you are seeing people rarely, so for instance, let's say maybe you only have 3 study visits this month and only 2 the next month, there are still things that you may want to do quality control because you want to make sure people are not forgetting how to do it. So monthly is a good time frame, but there are some things that may warrant weekly, and there is some stuff that could be done quarterly. So,
and who is the person to do that?
Well, it's a good question, and I think we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But some of that, it may be that there's 2 staff members that need to do it so that you can compare them against each other. Sometimes it may be that it's somebody compared against themselves, so you want to have them do it again. It may be that you're comparing this week to next week. And so you want to make sure anyone who's collecting the data is participating in the QC process for that data. So that you can always have a measure. You may have someone who's doing 80% of your blood pressures, but you want to make sure that the 20% that are being done by other staff are also fitting into your schedule so that you can make sure that they are, and it's often the staff that are doing it less frequently that are having a little bit more difficulty anyway, right? Sometimes what we've done too is we'll have, for instance, we'll have some studies that go out into the community and they'll be based at one site for 3 or 4 months. So you kind of do a little bit at the beginning and then maybe sparingly spot check monthly. Then when they get out to the next site, you do a more intense period again for a couple of weeks because it's a new place. They may have having to adjust what they're doing. Maybe they forgot a little bit. So
Yeah, that was just my next question in the multi-centric study. So
yeah.
Who should there be one supervisor kind of who checks all the data? Or?
Yes. So that's one of the roles of either coordinating center or the lead site. They should be receiving data on a pretty regular schedule and running through it and checking it, because sometimes that's the only way that you can see it. Data entry is one thing in particular that can be an issue, and so we often have studies do like 10% re-entry or 5% re-entry, and we'll compare pass 1 with pass 2 to see did they enter the data the same way. And when you do that, you probably want to have a different person do the second round so that you can make sure that that people can be consistent with themselves, but they may not be doing it the way that you want to do it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, great, good. Thank you for the question, and I hope I'll give you a little bit more detail on that too as we move through some stuff. So why do you want to have the data forms or screenshots? Partly it's just so that as you're talking about things in your descriptions, in your other chapters, you can refer to the form so people know what it is that you mean. It's always good to have a paper version because there's going to be that time when you can't get on the system for one reason or another and you want to have a backup, particularly when we were doing some interviews with parents and adolescents. We were going out to folks' homes, and even if we had a hotspot, there were times when we couldn't get to the online survey. And so being able to just have a paper version that you could go through was helpful. It also makes sure that there's some consistency with how the data are being collected across forms. And so having a version that's in the manual procedures that people can refer to is helpful. So I'm going to just briefly show you this, the Midas forms here, but you can spend some more time looking at it. Midas is midlife in the U.S., and they have some sub-studies, and one of the sub-studies is one that Sharon and I work on a lot, where they're doing a lot of biomarker collection. And so I think what I had thought we should look at was the self-administered questionnaire. Yep, so this is a version of, oops, dang it, looks like that link isn't active anymore. Did not check that today. Poor quality control here on the part of looking at my slides. Yep, all right, so we'll skip that for now. I'll try to find those forms and show them to you. It was just going to show you a couple different examples.
Usually update.
Yeah, so I don't know what the deal is. Anyway, maybe they moved them.
It looks like they killed all their files just from that.
It is strange. Well, we'll take a look. I'll send out some updated links if I can find them later. Let's see. Shoot. I'm just gonna have to do this. I've forgotten how to do it.
I actually have a sample of theirs. It's also, should I email you?
That's okay. It's all right. We won't worry about it today. Okay. So then data management. So what do you want to include in your data management information? You want to describe what's the system for entering data and logging it. And then you guys have heard me talk about this before, the transfer points. You want to make sure how are data or specimens or things moving from place to place. So you want to have that be in your data management system. And you want to make sure that you are reviewing those transfer points to make sure stuff is getting to where it needs to. So if you have that in your data management, then you can describe how are you going to be querying that. So are images getting transferred on a timely way to the reading center? A big one is, are lab values being returned to you so that you can flag alerts and get them out to people? And so that's another data management task that you want to describe.
What's the common scenario there in terms of red flags on the results? Because usually consent mentions that explains to the patient we would notify or something. How do you secure that things don't fall through the cracks? Which, by the way, happens.
Right, it does happen. It totally happens. And so that's part of what you want to have set up here. You want to have a system set up. We have a set of rules. We almost always have, with any of our studies, there's a physician that reviews all of the alerts. And we send out letters. So you receive the lab file. You have a system where you go through and you look at any of those that were alerts. You evaluate that. You look at it in the context of the other data for the person. And then we usually prepare a letter for that person that describes what it's for.
Does it require direct verbal communication, or a letter that is signed by the team is good enough?
Good question. So most of the time, most of the stuff that we're looking at, a letter is sufficient. But we do have emergency alerts where we'll call somebody and we'll say this came back and we think that this is a real problem and you need to see your healthcare provider today. That doesn't happen very often, but there are studies where we're doing some of those kinds of things.
And then I'm sorry for asking so many questions. And then someone selects, okay, there are all these results that are worth notifying, but they are non-emergent. Those we're going to mail. Mm-hmm. Those ones that are absolutely boring and irrelevant, we're not going to even mail. And those ones that require extra attention, we're going to mail and discuss. Is that kind of how?
Exactly. And you'll see, I'll talk a little bit in a few weeks about biomarkers in particular. One of the things that we've learned over time is that, particularly in studies like this, in order to promote trust with the investigators, we'll send them a report, even if it's meaningless. Not that it's meaningless, but that there's nothing they could do about it. So there used to be this big debate, well, why provide people information if it's not clinically meaningful? If they wouldn't do anything different about it, why give it to them?
Yeah.
And one of the things that we've learned is that that makes people not trust you. That they'd rather have their number, even if you can't tell them what it means, then they know that you actually measured something.
Yeah, but in a study such as Biomath, it's such a problem because you have all these abnormal CAT scans.
Yes.
And you're almost automatically having them call you back, what is this?
Right.
And the vast majority is nothing.
Right.
So you potentially, whatever you do, you're putting yourself in a potential problem.
This is exactly right. So one of the things that we try to do is, whenever we provide the results, I'm sure you guys do the same thing. We try to have some sort of layman language about, this is what this is for. This you probably don't need to worry about, but you might want to follow up with your provider. This is something you should see your provider. All those things, we have it go through the IRB, but it's still, you're right, you still end up with a lot. So I think there's not a good way around that, but we do try to triage, just as you were saying. So for the data management stuff, this is, again, you want to schedule something. You don't want to have, this is what you don't want to do. You do not want to have all of your screening data wait to be entered until you're done supposedly screening. Because then you can't look at it to see what might have gone wrong. So you need to set up something where you say, all the screening data get entered every week, but maybe the self-administered questionnaire that, maybe that can wait till the end of the study. So take a look at how important it is for you to be looking at that data in real time to decide the schedule that you want to have the data managed. And then have a process for review and queries. And Sharon's going to go through in detail the process of looking at queries with your data, but don't just query it. Figure out what you're going to do about it once you do query it. If you have a abnormally high value, what's your process for taking a look at that? What kind of what constitutes a high value? Okay. Then the best thing to know about these MOPs is that they're almost always written by a group of people, authorship by committee. One person is not writing this all on their own. It's helpful to have different sections get assigned to different people. Why? Well, it spreads the work around, but you also are probably then tapping into expertise on the part of different people. And study coordinators are often writing much of the first draft. They know the kinds of things that need to be put in there. They have a lot of experience, many of them, with what the kinds of things are that you're wanting to do. And then that helps you as investigators take a look and see what's missing instead of having to spend, the 20 hours writing all that out. So, manuals of procedure should be reviewed by all investigators, but also by data collection staff, because they're going to figure out something that you didn't know. They're going to look and say, we can't do that, or wouldn't this be more efficient? And you'd go, oh yeah, that would be great. Data management staff, because they're looking at it from a different point of view. And then laboratory and reading center staff. The laboratory folks, you want them to look at it because you want them to know, do they really think that they can do the whole set of processing steps that you want done? Do they have the resources to do that? It's nice that we now can get the lab 7 days a week. Used to be, they were only open 5. So we have some tubes that have to be refrigerated for 24 and then get put into a freezer 24 hours later. So we couldn't collect anything on Friday because there wasn't anybody in on Saturday to move it from the refrigerator to the freezer. So those kinds of things they can check, and you might not even be aware of that as being a problem. The other thing to remember about MOPs is that they're dynamic. They are not set in stone. You are going to revise them both as decisions get made and as you gain experience with your participants and with the places where you're getting your data collected. Do track changes and use version numbers so that you can be sure that everybody's using the same one. That's the nice thing about having things like Box now, or other kinds of places. If you're communicating with people in multiple places, then you at least have this electronic location where you can have the most recent version updated. These days, it's probably best to format it as if it's going to be electronic, if it's going to be web-based, but there are lots of reasons why you want to have a paper copy, because you want your staff to be able to grab the binder and flip through it instead of having to go log onto the computer, right? So depending on what things are, you may want to make sure that you've got a paper version. As we've talked about before, use flowcharts and illustrations when possible, and prepare this first draft in time for training. You want your staff to have this document for them when you do training, because this is the time when they're going to read it. They're not going to read it after they've already done training because they're like, I know how to do that. So almost always a manual procedure will get revised after training because you're going to figure out something doesn't work or somebody has a better idea. But if you can have, and it doesn't have to be pretty, but if you can have it together for them, it will really help. So, to revisit, what is it? It's this detailed documentation. It's used while you're collecting the data, but also as a historical record. Why bother? Because that just makes your data more consistent and it's easier to communicate with each other, and everyone writes it and it's not finished until you're done with your study. Okay, here's a couple of more places. I'm not going to go into them in detail, but these are all large epi studies. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the NHANES studies. This is the HRS. Oh, you can't see my screen. The third bullet is the HRS, or Health and Retirement Study. That's a large population survey of older adults. So these are all great resources, both for knowing what goes into a MOP, but they're all funded by federal funds, and so there's no copyright. So you can take their manual and just use it. There's no point in rewriting something if somebody already has a good version of it. And you can say, in your method section, we use the HRS procedure for waist and hip measurement. Done. So you don't
verbatim,
have to.
you can
Yeah.
pull what you need. You can adapt
exactly.
it to your.
You bet.
Well,
You
then
bet.
you should cite it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it should
Well,
be a citation.
Yeah, citation, but I mean, you don't have to.
Understood. Yeah,
yeah.
don't pass it off as your own.
But you don't have to go through. Yeah, exactly. But you don't have. You also don't. You don't
Just
have to
wanted make
rewrite
sure
it.
that was said.
Yes, thank you.
They
But you
simply-
don't have to start from scratch.
Told
I guess is
us.
what I was saying. Yeah,
Copy
right,
and
exactly.
paste.
Okay.
No,
So we ran through that quickly. We're going to be circling back to different pieces of this and drilling into some of the things about data collection, but that's what you want to have the manual together for. So what I'd like to try to do, if we can, now, is talk a little bit about IRB applications. So have any of you ever done an IRB application?
Yep.
Most have, okay. Todd, you're the only one who's like, no? Okay. So if I go too fast, stop me and we'll... Okay, so we all know what institutional review boards are. They're there to ensure that participants' safety and welfare are ensured, and it's definitely been an evolving understanding of what that is. All of you probably saw that when you did any of your CD training. You know, the history of IRBs was explained. And it continues to evolve. There's new things that we're learning and understanding all the time. I have some links down there that are just very interesting, different explanations of both reports about when IRBs should have been acting and they were not. And then also some great ethics materials. The stuff from Brown is really nice explanation of different ethics. Okay, so different types of IRB. There's a central IRB. It used to be that it was used for industry trials only. There's a big push right now at NIH to have a one IRB, meaning that if there's a study that's funded by NIH, only one institution is submitting an IRB application and it applies to everybody else. So it means that there's all these agreements that you have to be setting up. It's a new rule. Everybody's trying to figure out exactly how it's going to work. Different IRBs have different ways in which they like to do things. So it's working, but it's happening.
I'm sorry, does the center such as UCLA does not accept central IRB make difference in this, central versus local?
It depends. It depends on what the study is.
UCLA has a general concept that is no central IRB is accepted.
Well, unless it's mandated by the funder, and then it depends on. But you're right. They don't want. UCLA does not like to defer to another IRB unless there's one of these agreements that's set up. And so they're working much harder at trying to set up some of these agreements. And I have a meeting in a couple weeks with Allison Orkin, who's the head of the IRB, because we were setting up all of these reliance agreements and she's come back and said, I don't think you need to do that. And we're like, well, but we thought we did. So we're going to have to talk with her about why we were doing this in the way that we were sharing data. And some of it has to do with what the definition of engagement in research is. So it is definitely an evolving process. So, UCLA has 5. The North IRB basically covers everything that's sort of not medicine or behavioral research. South does public health, nursing, and medicine. And then the medical IRBs then specialize in different kinds of medical interventions. Oh, I forgot to post this reference. I'll put that reference up there for you. So then the single IRB policy at NIH, right? That's for multi-site studies, and that's when you identify one site that's doing all of the IRB, and then you set up the reliances. So let's talk about what's in an IRB application. So everything. Sounds dumb to say that, but they're going to want to know everything. So let's look at it more in detail. So you need to tell who is working on the project. And you need to specify people who are working with participants, but also people who are working with your data, who's working with the specimens, and are they all here or are they at other places? Now, the web IRB, back in the olden days, we would have piles of paper that we'd have to take to the IRB because you'd have to do 1 and then 10 copies and all this stuff. So web IRB has been fantastic for being able to streamline this process. So if you say that you're using the pathology portal, you don't have to do anything more. That's what's handling with the specimens. And then they know pathology portal is keeping everybody up to date on terms of their certifications and all that stuff. So it's really helped cross-institutional stuff. Then you want to be able to talk about who the participants are. So you're talking about who's working on the study. Then who are the people that are going to be in the study? How are they getting in? So we've talked a little bit about recruitment already. What are eligibility? We talked through some of that. Who decides if they're eligible? Super big issue, right? Because that's where a lot of some of this questionable activity on different people's part has come, where you have a single investigator that's screening everybody out who doesn't fit their criteria and not being transparent about eligibility. And then there's issues of special populations. So we'll talk about the special populations a little bit, but those are folks that for one reason or another may not be able to, there may be concerns that they may not be able to consent on their own. Then you need to talk about what are people going to do. So what are the procedures? What are the risks and benefits for participating in the study? There are benefits to participating in studies for sure, but we know there's risks. And then what's the resource commitment? So how much time do people need to spend? Do you have the money? Now they're checking. I don't know if you've seen this before, but the IRB now looks at how much money you say you're going to give to people, and then they compare it to your grant to be sure you actually have that amount of money to be sure you can really pay people. So you want to describe all of that. And then finally, after all of those questions are answered, then what's the scientific question that you're asking and how are you funded? Seems like you should start there, but it's actually a much broader piece. And again, they're not evaluating your science very much because that's not their job. That's the job of reviewers for your grants or your other kind of funding. They're concerned with what are people being asked to do, how are you doing it, and are you doing it in the most ethical way possible? So that's the link to the web IRB. You need to request an account, and you'll see I've got an example application that I've uploaded that's related to the Madres para la Salud study. Sorry. Okay, so to make sure that you are ethically involving students, everybody needs to do training to understand what is the current understanding of ethical involvement. There's different ways to do CD training. You can do social and behavioral. Probably doesn't work for most of you in this room. More likely, you need to do the biomedical staff and investigators one. And as we all know, once you've done it, every 3 years, you have to do a refresher. And that's good, because it's good to remind ourselves what are we doing and why are we doing it. In some cases, you may need to also complete the good clinical practice training. That's really only if you're your study is really tied, really integral to what's going on in the clinic, and that will be true for some of you, I know. And then we now know there's a research HIPAA. So have you guys all taken the research HIPAA training too? And that's important because the issues around health information for research are different than those for clinical stuff. So let me see. I'm wanting to make sure we have a little bit of time to talk about stuff. Let me see about what we want to do about consenting. Let's talk. I'm going to skip over these next couple of slides. We'll come back to them in another at the next class that I teach. But I want to talk a little bit about special consents. So it is possible to do a verbal consent. Verbal consents are when it's not practical to have a written consent. And that's when there would be ways in which, when you would sit down with someone, you would give them time to think through things. When would that be likely? When you call somebody on the phone and you're wanting to talk to them. Perhaps you're just doing a survey. At that point in time, if you say, do you consent to take this survey, then they've given their verbal consent to be involved in the study. And the IRB will allow that. You don't have to have a signed consent for every single study. You may also want to have a consent for screening versus being enrolled in the study. And that's usually when there's a high enough bar, particularly if it's involving some kind of radiation or blood draw, that there are some risks associated just with the process of screening. And so you may want to consent somebody for screening, and then you consent them to the study if they're eligible. There's diminished capacity. So that can be with older adults that may have some cognitive impairment. It may be with those who are mentally challenged. There's lots of different reasons why there may be diminished capacity. As much as possible, though, you want to make sure that the person who's judged to be of diminished capacity still understands what they're doing and why. Mm-hmm.
Can you maybe explain in which kind of studies can you use the verbal consent? Is it mainly retrospective? Because I cannot imagine that.
It's usually those that have minimal risk.
I have one, for example, like for ultrasound in patients in the ICU, to do a quick assessment with the ultrasound, which is non-invasive and 2 minutes and without any particular, that is part of, either way would be a standard of care. But it's not necessarily, it's still a study, and all I have is actually like verbal consent that they need to get. So I still would leave the informed consent on the paper, but I don't need any signatures.
But you may, for instance, you may want to call folks and ask them some things about you may identify that it may be early in your work on this particular topic, and maybe you want to contact folks that have a particular condition and find out, just get some information from them, like a verbal survey. So instead of sending them a survey, that you just want to talk to them over the phone. So verbal are almost always talking over the phone, but that's another great example. I'm going to remember that one because usually if you have them in person, you're going to want to have a signature, but that makes perfect sense. It gets complicated
when it's then, it's funny, but I need to explain it because it gets more complicated. So yes, while the patient can give verbal consent if patient is capable,
right,
alert, if the surrogate is giving the consent, then I need to have surrogate sign that surrogate accepts the role of a surrogate, at which point I'm getting a verbal consent, but yet I still have a paper that requires them to sign.
Exactly.
So it's like weird in that sense.
Right. No, that's exactly right. You have to document that they're an acceptable surrogate. Yeah, right. Exactly. And so that's what I was going to say here with diminished capacity, is that you want to make sure that you don't just accept that someone is a surrogate, that you're clear that they are a permissible surrogate for that person. So, for instance, you have to be clear with children whether it's a parent or guardian, and what does guardian mean. So it can't just in some cases, It may just be an adult that has control over what the child is doing. That's enough. But if it's of higher risk, then you may actually need to get their legal guardian or parent. So, so surrogates, yes, surrogates are definitely, and they have a whole flow chart for how to decide that. So children, as I just mentioned, you have to. Children alone cannot consent to be in a study. There has to be some sort of adult that also provides consent for them to be studied, unless it's like a minimal risk. It's something they're doing in school. They're filling out something. Even then, schools usually like to inform parents that a study is going on. Adolescents are an interesting bunch. Adolescents, they consider it 13 to 17. And adolescents cannot consent for most studies on their own, but they need to sign an assent that they agree to participate in the study. And this has to do with the power dynamic between a legal guardian and an adolescent. An adolescent has enough capacity to make some decisions, but not enough to be legally binding. Now, there are some exceptions to that, and it mostly has to do with whether or not the adolescent would be at risk if the reason that they were in the study was known. So that, issues having to do with drug use and sexual behavior, those kinds of studies might waive the parental consent depending on what else is involved with the study. So, you guys have any other interesting quirks or whatever that you've dealt with on consenting for different special populations?
I've had most of my patients have some degree of intellectual disability, and so I work with.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's true. Just thinking about.
So probably the most complicated setting is the adults with
Right.
intellectual disability, because like with kids, it's more standard to have parents
Exactly.
consent, but when it's adults, we have to take into consideration their level of functioning, because usually there's a range of
Yeah.
abilities and
Sure.
understanding from
Yeah.
the adults. And so then sort of each individual patient, we had an IRB say, sort of needs a capacity assessment and determine whether or not it's the individual or it's the guardian who is the consenter. And honestly, we just get both. So the time, unless the person clearly has no understanding whatsoever of what's going on, but if there's any question, we just have both.
That's a very good example, and that's often something that happens with older adults too, particularly if we're getting into those that may have some level of dementia, but not to the point that they're non-communicative. And so, sometimes we're told that a verbal consent by the patient, as long as there's a signed consent by the surrogate, is okay. But so that's a great example. Thank you for bringing that up. Well, some of the other things that we need to consider in terms of consent is non-English speakers. This is becoming IRBs are becoming much more aware of this, and it can be a challenge, right? To be able to have all your materials. It's not fair or ethical necessarily to exclude someone because they don't speak English. But making sure you have materials and staff that can effectively communicate with somebody, not just Google Translate, is an issue. And so this is something to carefully think about. It's not that IRBs won't let you do it, but you want to think about who your population is and making sure that there's some way in which that you can potentially involve someone in a study if they're non-English speaking. There are times when you may need to reconsent participants, and that happens perhaps as things change in your study. Either the risk of being in the study increases, or other information may have changed. Now, a waiver of consent can be provided. Lots of times this is how web surveys are done. So you have a study information sheet, and if you sort of read through that sheet and then continue on to the survey, by default, you're giving your consent. So it's not a formal, I consent to take this study. In very rare cases, you don't get any information at all. That usually has to do with when you are doing some kind of public observation. So perhaps you're looking at walking behavior across crosswalks or something like that, and you're documenting things, but you're not approaching those people, and then you wouldn't have to get consent. We'll talk some more when we talk about biomarkers about getting consent for long-term storage of specimens. That's very important. Sometimes almost all the time now, you can collect specimens and use them for your study, but then if you intend to store them long-term, that's a separate consent checkbox that you need to have the participant consider. All right, we're going to skip down. We'll come back to some of these things. I just wanted to review the 2 assignments. Yeah?
With this specimen, you mean also if you have like a biobank or something?
Yes.
Then you still they have to sign for that? Even?
It depends. IRBs are now making sure that people know that you'll be storing their specimen and that they say that that's okay. Because some people will say, you can do it for this study, but don't store my specimen. And it may be that you have to tell them what you're storing it for, because they may not have consented to use it for anything. That it's still something that's related to the general purpose of the study and the general goals of the study. So it's a little bit tricky, but yeah, we're going to talk about that because this is something I've done a lot of work with, and it's an important one to remember because so much of what we do now is involved with biomarker. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so the first assignment, you actually have 2 assignments due on Monday, but they're all about but it's okay.
We have one due this Wednesday, don't we?
Oh.
So this Wednesday is reading, and
Yes.
it's only going to be there. I actually uploaded.
Oh, sorry.
already.
So it's 3 assignments.
Yeah, but it's just read one of the 3 papers. It's not a big deal, and even if you don't have time, just skim through it and familiarize yourself with it. We're going to be reviewing it in class, so it's not an assignment you have to hand in.
So we should read either Keller or Record?
So
No,
that's different. That's different. So you actually have
yours. I'll explain.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So Keller and Record, read both of those. These describe a particular study, Madres para la Salud, and I want you to read it. They don't give you much data. They're describing their procedures. And from reading those studies, I want you guys to come up with the table of contents for that study's manual procedures. So you've seen what a table of contents looks like. So think about what are all the different chapters. So you need to see what are they measuring? Are they doing blood pressure? Are they doing a health diary? What are all the different things that they're doing? And then list what the data forms would be. So last class, we talked about different kinds of data forms. Make a note of what each data form is, who's going to complete it, self or staff, administrative information that would be needed. Like, remember, administrative information is something like the participant ID, the date of the date when it was done, maybe it's the week of something. So pay attention to the administrative data and any other special considerations. So is there something specific about that form that you need to consider? And think carefully about the title of the study. Look at the description of the people that are in the study and think about different versions of forms that you might need. Okay?
And that's due on next.
That's due on Monday.
But for example, for a table of contents, you wouldn't want us to necessarily write out blood pressure, height, weight, etc. That we could all you want is clinic examination. No,
I do want you to indicate what the different procedures are that you would that are being done. Yeah. So under clinic exam, what are the different things that are being done?
Okay.
Yes, thank you for asking for that. And then the other thing that I want you to do for this study is you'll see that uploaded is a PDF of the IRB application for this study, but there's some pieces missing. I want you to draft what the research design and methods would be. Well, you'll just read the study, so you know what the research design is. How much time is required for participants? And then what are inclusion and exclusion and eligibility determination? How is that done? And what are the risks and benefits? Now, each of these sections should be like, it's 3 or 4 sentences that's going into the paragraph. These aren't long. But from having read through those papers, you should know who these folks are. I've tagged it as being due on Monday. Feel free to let me know. This is not 6th grade. So I'm happy to give some extensions if you guys need to. It's just a Word document, doesn't need to be fancy. But what I really want to see is you've read through it and you're understanding what they're doing and you're thinking about how are they going to collect their data. So it takes a little bit of reading between the 2 papers to figure out exactly what the participants are doing. Okay? And I'm traveling most of this week, but I'll be on email all the time. Feel free to reach out to me by email. No questions.
And you prefer email submission of the assignments, or do you want to use CCLE?
You can use CCLE. I think I set it up as an assignment.
Okay. Yeah.
Tell me if I didn't. Is it there? Okay.
Just let you know about Wednesday. So Heather won't be in Wednesday. We're going to be discussing study design and different types of study design. The homework for that is so that you're prepared for the discussion that we're going to have in class. So I posted 3 papers. We are going to review certain aspects of all 3 papers, but please just familiarize yourself with at least one of them so that we can have a fruitful discussion. Yeah.
Sorry, do you know the authors of the 3 papers?
Yeah, the Stanford Low. So there's a folder that I put up for, it's under this week, and it says readings for 410.
Okay.
And then the 3 papers are Stanford, Low, and McMahon.
All right, super.